2 full weeks of talks, a draft agreement has emerged at the COP26 climate summit underway in Glasgow, with calls on nations in the world to phase out the use of coal power. Now, it states that carbon emissions must be reduced at all costs by 2022 in order to reach a goal of limiting global warming this century to 1.5 degrees Celsius. At issue that is at the core of the debates is over how rich nations have the duty to compensate poorer countries for damage caused by climate-driven disasters. And with this then, it remains to be seen if the final COP26 document will come up with a firm resolution on the issue. To talk more about this, let's bring in Greenpeace Africa's climate and energy campaign, Nhlanhla Sibisi. Good to see you again, Nhlanhla. I feel like you and I have convened our own COP summit. So we're sitting once again with a summit that was supposed to have wrapped up, 24 hours ago. Still no final resolution. Why is it always so difficult to get to that point?
I guess, Tembegile, that the haggling that we always see with the different COP sessions, it's mostly about national interest. Most of the governments that are actually partaking, if not all of the governments that are partaking in the COP session, are always putting their national interest up front. And one of the things that I would actually like to mention is that we actually would like to urge those nations to think a little bit more globally as opposed to their national interest. And that's the reason why we find that these sessions usually drag out for so long. If we were really serious about actually looking at what the climate change impact has on the globe, because it's not only going to affect South Africa, China, or the US alone, or countries individually, but it's actually going to affect us all as part of the globe. So I think that those countries should really think a little bit differently and be a little bit more ambitious in terms of meeting the target of 1.5 degrees, as you've mentioned.
So you've got, again, talk about phasing out the use of coal. South Africa is reliant on that for energy production. Eskom uses a lot of it. A switch to energy cars, electric cars, that also ties in with our energy crisis. Can South Africa really work with those two if they become ultimate resolutions?
Well, the way that we see it in terms of how we could come up with solutions, that first of all, as a country, we should admit that we have a very high carbon footprint. And being a country that relies over 90% of its energy comes from coal, and we know what the impacts of coal are on the environment, we should actually be thinking differently. So in terms of the options that we have various options, including renewable energy, etc., that we can actually transition to. And I think from a national perspective, one of the things that we should consider is that how do we implement the just transition that we've been talking about, and who are the stakeholders that we're actually involving in terms of getting to this just transition? Because for us as a country, this is the most important thing that we should actually be putting on the table right now, to make it a point that we look at our carbon footprint, because this does have not only an impact in terms of the environment, but in the long term, it's going to have an impact in terms of the products that we are producing. So that's an economic impact in terms of when we trade with other countries. There will be countries, and we've heard those talks already from the countries like the European Union, where they are saying that they are going to heavily tax countries that are producing products from this carbon footprint that I've mentioned.
And South Africa is set to receive about $8.5 billion in order to help end our reliance on coal. This was one of the early announcements in the first week of the COP summit. But can we really, realistically, looking at the state of our energy sector in particular, can we phase it out perhaps in the next decade?
Well, the way that we see this aid that has actually been offered to South Africa, it's one step in the right direction. But I'm hoping that there are not dire actually conditions that have been put in terms of this aid. But what we'd like to see going forward is that the aid that has been offered is that how do we use it to get to a sustainable development and implementing clean and sustainable energy, so that we don't continue using coal the way we're using. But also, to begin, I'd like to add that in the long run, it's not only about what is offered to South Africa, it's about what is offered, is offered globally, and especially countries that are well developed in terms of what they are doing. Because it's one thing offering something to a country that is in a developmental stage, but it's another thing as to what they are doing. So it must be balanced. It must not be an expectation that countries like South Africa should phase out their coal, but they continue using their coal. Like in the instance of China and the US, we see also in the UK they've ramped up their coal use.
And in all fairness, of course, the goal for phasing out the use of coal in South Africa is at about 2050. That's the year, which gives us, about 30 years to do so. And often when we have these climate conversations, people who don't believe, for example, in global warming think it's a very high-end discussion between scientists and the likes of yourself. But in South Africa, there's a very real impact, at least where coal is concerned, in areas like Mpumalanga, where you've got power stations and communities are saying they're dealing with a very real effects, people becoming ill, lungs being affected as a result of the pollution.
So that's one thing that especially business needs to consider. That they cannot do business on a dead planet. And if they are not getting involved in the just transition and coming up with tangible solutions in order for us to actually make this just transition that we've been talking about to be practical, then we might as well just stop talking. But the point is that it's not about stop talking. We can't stop talking about these issues. We have to be talking about them. But it's about how we're going about in getting the just transition going. And absolutely correct in terms of these communities that are devastated by coal, because we've now reached a stage where, as you rightfully mentioned, that there's quite a lot of people who are actually been sick, and we've been ignoring these things because there are different ailments that have, through research that has not only been done by Greenpeace, but by different, other organizations. We see that we have a problem on our hands that we're ignoring, but we're more focused on the economic part. And I think we should actually be moving away from that thinking and getting to a point where we are inclusive in the thinking that communities, human lives are also being impacted.
What happens, Nhlanhla, if there is no agreement from Glasgow this year?
Well, to start with, organizations like Greenpeace will just continue pushing it to make it a point that these countries, whether it's South Africa or the big players, China and the US, that they understand. And what is interesting is that I'm sure, Thembekile, you have noticed that the youth have now come up strongly in favor of countries addressing these issues. Now, this youth that we are talking about is the youth that are very much cognizant. They are more informed than we were during our days. They are more informed and they are standing up. And that's a good thing, because now it's telling us that the future generation or the future leaders are actually now holding us to account. And what needs to happen is that the leaders of the different countries need to actually start listening. And I think it's about time that starts happening. And not to mention that the island countries have always been making the right noises in terms of saying that, we will be the most affected because at some point in time it means that those islands will be under sea. And this is not, it's not a fantasy, as you also alluded. That there are some people who do not really grasp the impacts of climate change. And I think people need to start actually looking at the different studies, including the IPCC reports that have come up from the UN. These are reports, scientific reports and research that's actually telling us that we're in code red. And being in code red, it means that we don't have any more time to dilly-dally. We now need to start implementing actions, and which is why this COP26 is very important. It must come out with a resolution, and it must come out with tangible and ambitious resolutions in terms of what we are going to implement immediately when they finish.
Nhlanhla Sibisi, always good to speak to you. Nhlanhla is a climate and energy campaigner with Greenpeace Africa. We've just been showing you in the last few moments, if we have time, to bring you a live shot of those Glasgow deliberations where the various countries are still making their final points. We're going to let Nhlanhla go now because I'm hoping we can bring up that picture from Glasgow if there's time. There it is, Australia making its contribution as deliberations continue on a final text to emerge from the COP17, well, not COP17, because that was in South Africa. This is COP26 underway in Glasgow, Scotland.